Because so it probably won't tell you, but that's what's happening usually.
I've never seen that before while I'm recording.
Okay, so shall we start? Okay, yeah. Thanks all for joining this morning or lunchtime for you almost. And yeah, it is a bit strange because I don't know any of you and you live in a very different situation from me. So yeah, I would really appreciate to just if you have any, I mean, first of all, if you have any comments or questions, to put them in the chat. And also, if you want to, it's obviously up to you, but if you wanted to put on your video, it just makes me feel that there are people here and I don't just talk into a void. So Vajrachakshu is really just recording me and nothing else is going to be visible on the YouTube. So here we are. So this morning is going to be about socially engaged Buddhism. And it is sort of part of Buddhist Action Month, which is an initiative in a way to remind Buddhists that Buddhism doesn't just happen on the cushion. Because I think sometimes the way Buddhism has particularly been translated outside of Asia, we can have this picture that it's about working with our minds in meditation, and it's not so much about what's happening in the world. But I firmly believe that the outcome of practicing has to be that one is kinder and more generous and more loving, and that needs to express itself in the world. Um, Otherwise, it's not really happening in a way. So for me, that's really, really important. So it's a very important topic to me. And I maybe just start a bit talking about my background. So before I ever set foot in a Buddhist center or even knew what Buddhism really was, I was part of some environmental initiatives and some political initiatives because I just felt it's so important how we live together and how we treat animals. That was a very important thing to me at the time. And so that's been a very strong part of my life. And when I decided to be a Buddhist, I immediately became a vegetarian. That was sort of like the first thing that the first thing that happens in my life, the first change. And I was 15 then, so I had only like a very faint clue what this whole Buddhism thing was actually about. Um, but over time, as I met the Buddhist group in which I'm ordained now, Triratna, um, the question, it was really important to me to find a way to express my Buddhist practice in line with these values. So if Buddhism was only about like going on retreats and hanging out in the Buddhist center, then that wouldn't be for me. So it was really important for me to find people who similarly wanted to make a change in the world and were really interested in what was happening out in the world and what was happening with the environment and with other people, and how to be of benefit in those situations. So yeah, so that's why it's a really important topic to me. And so I'll just talk. So I will start with the Buddha and my understanding of what the Buddha did, and yeah, where he role modeled some of some of those values. And I'm also going to talk about Dr. Ambedkar a bit, because I think he's a really important other example. And I'm going to talk a bit about different, more contemporary examples of Buddhists taking action. And then I will also talk a bit about like what are the different options that we actually have as Buddhists if we want to make a change in the world. How do we think about that, and which options do we have? I will talk about a Buddhist ideal, which is called the Bodhisattva ideal, which is really relevant to this. And I'm going to end on the sort of ethical guidelines that we follow and how they might point us into the direction of what we might want to do or want to avoid doing. And that's really all just my perspective. But I hope it will give you some food for thought. And yeah, as I said, like if you've got any questions, anything not clear or whatever, just put something in the chat, and that gives me a little bit of feedback and something that I can sort of like build into my talk. So let's start. So yeah, so 2,500 years ago, the Buddha, who was in many ways from like quite a privileged background in that he was from a family that was ruling the area at the time, and he was living in very sheltered, sort of very protected life. He left his home because he knew there was something more to life than just this. And it was very much initially a personal quest where he was looking for liberation, and he tried out various ascetic things and then tried out meditation, and eventually he sat down under the Bodhi tree and gained enlightenment. And then very almost inextricably linked with that experience, or like the next big step was then to share this experience with other people. And he started doing that by going back to some of the people that had been on a similar quest as him. So some of the ascetics he'd been sort of friends with for a while. And from there, sort of community grew. And what the Buddha did around most of his life is he walked from one place to the next, and he met people. He also sat down to meditate a lot and taught his disciples, his students. But a lot of what he did is he walked and he met people and he talked to people. And when we look at what sort of at the scriptures that we've got in the various translations, he talked to all kinds of people. Like he talked to rich people, poor people, men, women, people of all kinds of different status, and that was really important. And as soon as those people had entered his Sangha and were following sort of his teachings, he really, really encouraged them to let go of whatever groups they had been before and not to hold prejudice against each other. So an important part of that was the caste, sort of I guess the caste system was already part of Indian society at the time. So people would be born into a particular caste and then had a sort of like almost like divinely given task that they had to fulfill in life. And for some people, that might have been teaching scriptures or being a warrior, but for other people, it was shoveling excrements. And then that whole thing, it came with a lot of prejudice. So for these people who were part of the lower castes or even under the caste system, there was quite heavy discrimination against them, and that people didn't want to touch them. They didn't even want to, it was seen as even negative if somebody of that caste would cast their shadow onto somebody else. And there is there is an interesting sutta where the Buddha meets somebody called Sunita, who is part of that caste, that people that basically deal with the excrements. And so Sunita he has heard of the Buddha, and I think at someday the Buddha and some of his disciples walk past him. And because he knows that he's like polluting to people from other castes, he goes really out of his way to not even cast a shadow on the Buddha. He goes into a stream of water to just be as far away from the Buddha, to not have any to not get in his way in a way. But the Buddha, he notices that and he stops and he addresses Sunita and is just really friendly to him, really. And Sunita is a bit confused and sort of makes a step back further into the stream. And eventually, the Buddha, he makes a step forward and he goes into the stream and to meet Sumita and really talks to him and just addresses him as a normal human being, basically, and is really friendly to him. And is just interested in Sunita as a person. And Sunita is quite overwhelmed by this really basic experience of just being treated like a normal human being and not somebody who just belongs to a particular caste and has a very, very unappealing job. And it really makes a lot of difference to him. And eventually he joins the Buddhist community, the Buddhist Sangha, and becomes one of the disciples of the Buddha. Now, the fact that the Buddha talks to untouchables is not being lost on people. And there is a sort of rumor going around town afterwards, like, oh, the Buddha, he talked to this guy who's actually he's got a really important job. He has to shovel our excrements. How dare the Buddha sort of like elevate people like that? Where would we get to if these people would get a bit ahead of themselves? And eventually the king hears of the whole story and is a bit like, now that's not good. There is a law and order in this place, and maybe the Buddha is doing things that are actually threatening that. So eventually he decides to go and see the Buddha. He would go and see the Buddha regular anyway, but he decides to actually have a chat with the Buddha about this. And so one day he goes and just as he approaches as the king approaches where the Buddha's dwelling place is at the time, where he's holding residence with like all his disciples and gives them regularly teaching. There's this one monk, it's a new monk, and he can just see that he's very, very radiant. He's very, very radiant. There's like a group of other people dotted around and just listening to this man, this monk, and being quite impacted by the radiance of this monk. And so the king goes past and goes to the Buddha and has a chat with the Buddha and sort of like, oh, this monk, who is it? Like, I've not seen him before. And the Buddha's like, oh, that's Sunita, the former outcast. Isn't he radiant? Isn't he such a good disciple? He really embodies our values. Isn't that beautiful? And the king is sort of like speechless because he was going to give the Buddha a bit of a talking to, but really he can see the impact that it has on, that's the transformative impact and the positivity in what the Buddha has done. So I think that's a really lovely little story on just, I guess, the impact real kindness has, but also on like how integral being aware of your the social structure and what we can do as Buddhists and how integral it is, and that we have actually a role model in the Buddha. So I'm going to show some slides. It's really just to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to show you a little slide now. So very recently, I had the good fortune of being on pilgrimage in India. And just going to swap to the right slide. My computer is a little bit slow, but here we are. Yes, I had the very good fortune to be on a pilgrimage in India with some of our Indian brothers and sisters. So quite a lot of our Buddhist movement is in India, and it's inextricably linked with this man you can see on many of these pictures, who is Dr. Ambedkar. So Dr. Ambedkar, he was born into this untouchable caste, which is, or they're not former untouchable caste, like the legal name has now changed. But so he experienced a lot of discrimination when he was even a small boy. Like people wouldn't want to cut his hair, or like he was one day he was thirsty and had to, because he had to wander from one place to the next by foot, and nobody wanted to give him any water, and he wasn't allowed to drink from like the stream. So it was sort of like he was impacted by that, and at the same time was a very, very intelligent, very learned man. So he ended up going to Harvard and to LSE and having several doctorates. And when he came back to India, he was still being discriminated. Like he had a scholarship from somebody in a local government in India, and got a job in this office of this local government person. And literally, the other people in the office were just not even wanting to touch him, or even the files that he had touched, like where it was soaring heat, nobody wanted to give him any water, and he wasn't allowed to drink from the water the other people would drink from. So it was really quite humiliating. And I think there was a really important moment in his life where he just needed to get some accommodation to start a new job. And nobody would put him up because he was an untouchable. And in the end, he sort of pretended to be a Parsi to get accommodation at a Parsi's home. But they found out who he really was and kicked him out. And that really, I think, really changed something in him. And he decided that the quest of his life would actually be to get better, make the situation of the former untouchables better, and get them some rights. So because he was trained in law, his first way of doing that was by write well he ended up writing the Indian constitution, and he tried to safeguard rights for the former untouchables and other lower class and in there. And then once and there was quite it was quite difficult because and that's quite interesting because for us in Britain, and also where I come from in Germany, we all know about Gandhi and his sort of like quest for like peaceful justice and all that sort of stuff. But Dr. Ambedkar, he actually sometimes was at loggerheads with Gandhi about how to best safeguard rights for untouchables. And so not all the things that he had really wanted to put in the constitution, he could actually put in the constitution. And then afterwards, when they made him a law minister, he tried to get better rights for women. And that really wasn't happening because that really, a lot of conservative people were very against it. So he resigned over this. But he still had this question like, how can the former untouchables, how can they be free, and how can they just be treated as human beings? And in the end, he thought that because the caste system was so linked with Hinduism, that the people would have to leave Hinduism. But also because it's India, they couldn't just be without a religion. So he sort of looked at different religions and which religions, in his opinion, might be best conducive to a human development. And he decided on Buddhism. He felt that Buddhism was actually most conducive for humans to reach their potential. And so he converted to Buddhism, and he invited all his followers, and he was a very, very famous person at the time when he lived and still is in India. And so to convert with him. And this really meant that while Buddhism had sort of like almost died out in India for like quite a long time, suddenly there were again like millions of Buddhists. And tragically, he died just a few weeks after this mass conversion. But it had such a big impact on people. They, for the first time, they experienced themselves as agents in their own life, and also being able to stand up to discrimination. And he knew Sangharakshita, who was the founder of the Buddhist movement, Buddha Trakshanaya part of. And so our Sangharakshita, he actually, and he was in India at the time, so he actually consoled some of the followers. And since then, it's a very close link between I mean, it's the same order, but it's a very close link between a lot of the followers of Dr. Ambedkar and our sort of like Indian order members, who are often see themselves primarily as followers of Dr. Ambedkar, or like Buddhists in India often primarily see themselves as followers of Dr. Ambedkar and like socially active, and then secondary like as followers of Buddhism. So that's a very interesting dynamic because it completely challenges the way that maybe many of us have sort of think about Buddhism. And so I just want to say a little bit about each of these pictures. So the big picture is basically in Nagpur, the place where Dr. Ambedkar is buried. And it looks like a modern version of a stupa, a memorial to the Buddha. So people hold him in such high regard that it mirrors, in a way, a symbol of the grave of the Buddha. And so I think that's really quite remarkable. And there's lots of people around visiting and paying their respects all the time. And then the small pictures from left to right. So left is at one of the Buddhist centers in Pune, a statue of Dr. Ambedkar. And then the next, the one with like the pictures and the flower, that's in one of the social projects. So this is an education project that the Indian order is running, and just in the sort of like as and you go there, and in lots of places there's just pictures of Dr. Ambedkar, and always with like loads of flowers. So he's always held in memory. Then we've got an image of the walking Buddha. So that's across the Buddhist world actually quite an unusual depiction of the Buddha. He's either like sitting or standing, and then there's also pictures of him lying down at the end of his life. But to Dr. Ambedkar, the image of the walking Buddha was very, very important because he said, like, he's the Buddha, uh, he is active in the world, and he walks, and he walked everywhere. And that's why he really liked this walking Buddha. And also notice that the right hand, the posture of the right hand, so that's the mudra, the hand sign for fearlessness. So he's walking and in a fearless way. So then the next picture is again of Dr. Ambedkar, and this is also in Nagpur in a conference hall from another Buddhist tradition, but still Dr. Ambedkar has this central piece in a way. And then we've got a picture of the Buddhist center in Pune on like a day retreat. And there was a talk, and the talk again just mentioned Dr. Ambedkar. And finally, we've got this program, which is again from another, sort of like another Buddhist center, and Dr. Ambedkar is there. So he's still having such a massive effect, and in a way, he does embody, and his followers really embody how Buddhism needs to be, is also is how social activism, if you want to call it like this, is really an important part of Buddhism, because in order for people to be receptive to the teachings of the Buddha, they need to have food, they need to be safe, they need to have a roof on top of their heads, and that sort of stuff. Many of those basics are not in place. So a lot of the people who are associated with the movement in India, they are doing stuff like setting up little schools, and I don't know, running hostels for girls that don't have parents anymore, and that sort of stuff. It's such an important part of the way they practice. So I just want to, just wanted to share that so you've got a bit of an idea of that. And also, I think linked to that, I'm just now going to skip forward. So this is a quote from Sangharakshita, who founded our movement. And it's, for me, it's the most inspiring quote, or like one of the most inspiring things that he said. And he did actually say this in India while addressing an audience of followers of Dr. Ambedkar and other people of lower castes. So he said, "This is one of the reasons I am a Buddhist. I believe that humanity is basically one. I believe that it is possible for any human being to communicate with any other human being, to feel for any other human being, to be friends with any other human being. This is what I truly and deeply believe. This belief is part of my own experience. It is part of my own life. It is part of me. I cannot live without this belief, and I would rather die than to give it up." So I think this, yeah, it's very strong. And while our main teacher, Sangharakshita, he's never been like, I don't think he's been the sort of person who like goes to protests or encourages that sort of stuff very explicitly. I think when I look at this quote and what's behind it, I think it really, there's something shining through of this. What does it really mean to be friends with any other human being? Like, it means that solidarity, it means reaching out to people. It means loving people as they are, with all their differences, and not just the ones that look like us or are from a similar background. So yes, so that's that. I'm just gonna, I can't actually look at the chat at the moment, but I don't think there's been any comments yet, has there? Okay, good. So I'm gonna continue. And I think the next thing, yes. So the next thing we're going to, I'm just gonna have a sip of coffee. So as Buddhists, what options do we then have to be active in the world? And here I want to bring in this woman, Joanna Macy. She's an American. She is now really quite elderly. She might be like 80 or 90. I don't know her exact age. But she's worked for decades with people who wanted to make it and want to make a change in the world. Like may that be around like peace, preventing war, around environmental stuff. She's been sort of working with those people for decades. And she doesn't call herself a Buddhist, but she follows Buddhist teachers and is very, very, that what she does is very, very in line with Buddhism and Buddhist teachings. And so she talks about, there are sort of like, here it's called the Great Turning, but there are three types of activism, or three types of being active in the world, broadly, three categories. And so the first thing up here is holding actions. So that's often when we, for example, hear activism or even protest, the first thing we think about. We think about people who are protesting against something, yeah? Who are, I don't know, writing a petition against, to stop something, who maybe block something. So this is sort of like, she calls it holding actions, and it's trying to prevent something from happening, trying to prevent harm from happening. But really, that is just one of the options that we have. Another one is the one in red here, which is she calls shifts in consciousness. And in a way, as Buddhist practitioners, this is our bread and butter. This is what we work on every day. We're working with our mind. We're working with our tendency to other. We're working with our tendency to want more. We're working with greed, hatred, and delusion, and how to be with our experience in a way that we don't have to push away all the time, and we don't have to grasp onto things all the time. So what we all do in a way, it it is part of this shifts in consciousness. So in our small ways, when we practice, we are in a way we are activists. We are doing something that's quite revolutionary, that's quite against a lot of the sort of dominant culture. And then we've got the third circle here, which is cultural changes. So really what this means is building the world we want to live in. So what this can mean, for example, is being part of like a Buddhist group or Buddhist retreat, or going to a retreat center, or being part of a center. So for example, I managed a Buddhist center in London, and it's really about like how can we role model how we would like the world to be. Yeah. And that can be in really, really small steps. This can just be like having a network of friends where we reach out and help each other. Yeah. Where we really look after each other, even though we're not family, we're not related with each other. There's no obligation to help each other. We're building that network where we look after each other and we're there for each other. It also means, particularly in the UK context of our Buddhist group, there's some businesses and institutions and retreat centers and Buddhist centers. So there's an opportunity to employ people. There's an opportunity to really create a bit of like this world that we want to live in, that's working across embodying different values from this is a society outside, which is very much around like consumption, very much around you versus me. um so ways in which we can embody and bring really into life more solidarity, more love, and all, yeah, those sorts of things. So these are the three options that we have broadly, and different ones of us will be inclined to different of these, or like to maybe one particular circle, or as we go through life, we might be drawn to a different circle. So, for example, I think I started off with holding actions, maybe. So I was doing well activism and political stuff before I actually started to work with my mind. Once I started to work with my mind for a while, I completely withdrew from holding actions. I was just looking at my mind and how I could be a better person. But actually, activism for me was, or being socially engaged, it took a bit of a back burner. Although I was working as a doctor, and you could say like there is obviously an altruistic aspect in that. Although I did find it under the working conditions I was in quite difficult to embody. And as I sort of made some headway with that and got to know other Buddhists, I got really interested in this third circle of structural changes, or embodying the world we want to live in. And I think, so for example, now my decision to leave my career, I was working in public health and in the health system, but to work in a Buddhist center, it was very much around like, how can I contribute building the world I would like to live in, a world that is more driven by compassion, generosity, and values like that. But I keep on still doing all three of these things. I still work with my mind, and I'm still part of some Buddhist activist groups, and sometimes we block roads, or we write petitions. So it's sort of, it's it's a model. I find it a helpful model, these three circles, in order to reflect on where am I most effective at this moment in time, with the skills I have, with the limitations I have. So that's that. Any questions so far? I don't think there are any. Okay, so I just want to give a few more examples around like what that can look like. Just a few different examples, because it can take a million different shapes, basically. Okay, so here's an example. So as I said, I was in India like a few months ago, and this is the ITBCI school, which was founded by Dado Rinpoche. So Dado Rinpoche was a Tibetan teacher, and he was one of the main teachers of our main teacher. And he had to flee from Tibet when there was the Chinese invasion. And he was a very accomplished Lama, and he had a chance to, because the is I don't want to go into the detail, but I guess the in Tibet, sort of like the religious hierarchy and the political hierarchy, they were quite entwined. So I would have had a chance to just focus on that, to just be a very important teacher and be part of of the Tibetan sort of like lineage and leadership. But when he had to leave, and when he arrived in Kalimpong, which is this place in the hills in India, what he realized is there were so many refugees and a lot of small kids. And the small kids, they would need some education. And ideally, they would need some education where they would still be able to learn Tibetan and their sort of like Tibetan cultural roots. And that was really important to him. So instead of just focusing on maybe heading up a monastery, which he did at the time, or doing sort of scholarly things, he started this school. So in the middle, you see a picture of the school, and to the bottom left, I mean, you can hardly read it, but it says ITBCI school. And so that's the school in Kalimpong, which was running for decades. And on the right, so Dada Rinpoche, he died some years ago, but they made this picture I've taken. I'm not good at taking pictures, so I apologize. But anyway, so they made this, I think it's a wax cast of how he looked like. It's in the school. So, and there are some really, really moving sort of excerpts of how Dada Rinpoche sort of like spent his days. He would get up like ridiculously in the morning and do hours of meditation and hours of administration. And then still, rather than taking a break, go to the school and play with the kids and help those that had just arrived and that had to do a bit of catching up, help them along so they would be able to follow the school program. And that was really, really important to him. And so he did it every day. So that's, I think, an example of this. And I think it's important to say it did wind some people up that he chose to live his life like this and not just be like a scholar and a head of a monastery. So that wasn't the easy path, but he chose to do it because he thought that was the most appropriate thing to do. This is a bit random. I was also going to talk about I'm going to skip to this woman. Yeah, so basically, so this is Shraddha Pushpa. She also died a few years ago, unfortunately. So in London, there's this one big Buddhist center, which I think Vajrashakti he's smiling. I think you were based there also quite a while ago. So when the Buddhists in London were looking for a place to stay, they found this disused fire station. And that was just a building to start a Buddhist center. But unfortunately, I mean, the environment around this disused fire station was quite poor. There were a lot of right-wing nationalists around, and there was a lot of immigration around as well. And so it was quite a particular area. So this woman in this picture, she's already quite old and frail, but so her, yeah, I mean, she was quite a woman. So Shraddha Pushpa, as a child, her family fled from the Nazis, and then she went to the UK, and she became a teacher in this area. And she was known in the whole community of like just reaching out to people from all kinds of backgrounds. She learned the languages of those who immigrated to the area, so like Bangladeshi, and she went above and beyond as a teacher, and she also really where she could protected people from like being harassed or just discriminated by the nationalist people that were around. And she worked as a teacher, but also she started this Globe Community project. So Globe Community is like the little area around the Buddhist center. And there she really knew like all the shopkeepers and all the people working living on the various estates. And she really made it her project to reach out to people. So not just wait who's coming through the doors of the Buddhist center, but offer a meditation in ways that people like from all kinds of different backgrounds, which maybe they couldn't speak English, that they could really partake and benefit from it. And this project is still going, although Sherpa she died a few years ago. And so I think that's really another, and they've won prizes and everything because they really, yeah, embody this sort of like fearless going out in the world. And it's, I think, another very, very good example of like how being socially engaged, how that can look like by building the world you want to live in, the Buddhist Pure Land in a way. So that's, I think, another example. So then we have, I'm actually going to start here. So this is a completely different way of what that might look like. So this is environmental protest in the United Kingdom over the last few years. So there was a new group. So basically what happened was out of a retreat center, which is aligned with like the inside Buddhism, so more sort of Theravadan. There was a group of Westerners who meditated, but were also really, really interested in like doing stuff for like the environment and the climate. And they joined in with some of the really big protests in the UK around climate change and stopping fossil fuels. And so this started in 2019, and it's really big protests where roads are being blocked over like several days. And there's a lot of police because the police gets very nervous, people get arrested. And over the right here in the that's people peacefully sitting in a bank and just, I mean, this is it's a bank that invests in fossil fuels. And and so this is peaceful protest, yeah. And even it does involve meditating in public, which is a very interesting experience. If you've never tried it, I mean, obviously you could think about doing it sometime somewhere, maybe not in the middle of the road, but somewhere. It's quite an interesting experience because you don't have that sort of like quietness. You just have to work with whatever there is. And it's really making a statement because I think often when we're talking about holding action, that can be perceived as maybe being quite angry. But I think having been part of these protests, it makes such a difference to be there as meditators. People really appreciate it. It affects the whole atmosphere, and it also invites other activists to join in and to resource themselves, but also it just makes a very powerful statement to people who want to say like, oh, you're always against stuff and you're so angry. Actually, look at these peaceful meditators. So it's quite a powerful statement. And then coming out of that, where am I? Here. There was then within our movement, Triratna, a group that formed, the Triratna Earth Sangha. And so we've also been doing various things. So some of it is, again, meditating in the public. So here on the right, you've got a picture. This time it's a park. There's no police around. It's a bit more relaxed. But also going to festivals and just talking about the environment and how as Buddhists, what we can do about it. So that's what you can see here on the left. And also we've been organizing a couple of online conferences and a couple of online retreats, one of which just finished a few days ago. So those things get advertised by the Buddhist Center online, which you all have access to if you want to. So that's something, a way of reaching out to other people and creating a community of like-minded people so that we then can look at what we can do in our various contexts, because we all live in different places and have quite different opportunities. So I think, do I now have 10 or 15 minutes left, Vajrachakshu, approximately, isn't it? 10, yes, good. Okay, so finally, yada, 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 here we are, okay. So I just, so what underpins all of this, and obviously what we do as Buddhists is we have this ethical compass, the precepts. So, so as Buddhists, we're trying to work with our minds and we're trying to avoid greed, hatred, and delusion, but that can be really quite tricky sometimes. So as to help us, we've got these training guidelines, and these are the ones that we tend to practice. And I just want to say a little bit about most of these, and in relation to this topic of engaged Buddhism. So I think the first one is, I mean, super important. I undertake to abstain from taking life, and the positive one is, with deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. So you can think of this in a very literal sense, around like not killing, not injuring. And I think I already mentioned, like for me, the aspect of not eating animals was very, very important in this. So that's one way I have connected with this. But also, I think it is much, much broader, and it's really, the more you look into this, the more complex and the more opportunities to practice loving kindness and sort of not taking part in harm there is. So for example, I've been reflecting on like all where the things I buy come from and what's involved in that, and if the people, like what conditions for humans and animals are created in the places that make some of the things that I might buy, because that is all very invisible. Like as I buy my, I don't know, coffee or my clothes or whatever. But as we know, and as you know, because I also know some stuff gets produced in Turkey, the conditions there can be quite tricky. But increasingly, I've also been thinking about oppressive systems in a way. So where, for example, I know for example, in the United Kingdom, like I pay tax, and some of the tax will be used to deport refugees and that sort of stuff, or now to build a refugee, this place in Uganda where they want to put the refugees and that sort of thing. So it's sort of like, and I'm not quite sure what I can do about it, but I think it's just just becoming aware of where in our lives, and it might be invisible, we might actually be taking part in harming other beings. And I think stopping, or like looking at what we consume, that sort of stuff is quite a good starting point. So then the second one is undertake to abstain from taking the not given, and with open-handed generosity, I purify my body. And I think this one is of exceptional importance, particularly for like environmental stuff. Because one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in is because of this overconsumption that's been happening. And a lot of it is taking the not given, because we've taken much more from the earth than it's sustainable. So then the question is like, how can I live a simpler life? What do I really need? And how can I embody that in my life? How can I live with my cravings, and sort of manage them in a way, and really reflect on the impact that what I do has, and also how can I create an environment where yeah, that's more generous to that's more generous to the world in whatever situation I'm in. And that will look very, very different depending on where you are and what options you've got. Might have like a garden or something, or you might just look at again where you buy stuff from, or it might be just being interested and really learning more about the environment. I've been over the last couple of years been learning much more around the local birds and trees and that sort of stuff. So that also provides an intimacy with the environment. I'm not going to say so much about the third one in this talk, but I do want to say the abstaining from sexual misconduct and stillness, simplicity, and contentment. I'm going to move on to the fourth one, which is I undertake to abstain from false speech, and with truthful communication, I purify my speech. I think this is also another absolutely crucial one, particularly as we're talking about social engaged Buddhism. Because I think one of the key issues we have at the moment is around division. And I think it's so crucial as we feel passionate about a topic, and that might be like the environment or something to do with social issues, to not further divisions. And that can be really quite difficult to do. I find it quite difficult to stand in truthfully for what I believe to be yeah, compassionate, but also staying open to people who maybe have a very, very different approach to what that means. And so how, yeah, really looking at what do we talk, who do we talk about? Social media is a big topic. I think that's really absolutely crucial in this area to try and not other. And yeah, the fifth one I'm also again gonna keep very, very short. Taking intoxicants. Undertake to abstain from taking intoxicants, and a positive one with mindfulness clear and radiant, I purify my mind. Again, it's sort of like yeah, really taking out distraction and intoxicants and really being with what's happening, being more open, and yeah, really noticing what's happening around oneself beyond one's immediate sort of family and group of friends. It is quite a practice. It does require some mindfulness. And at the same time, also not going down a rabbit hole of listening to the news so too much, so that one gets really, really anxious and is not possible, is not in a good headspace to really come from an open-hearted place anymore. So yeah, I think this sort of brings me to the end of my talk. So we started off with the Buddha, and particularly talking about the Buddha and Sunita and the caste system. And then I've talked a bit about Dr. Ambedkar and how he really embodies socially engaged Buddhism, and how for the Indian order that's absolutely crucial and really can challenge our idea around like how Buddhism primarily is a personal thing. I gave you this quote from Sangharakshita, which I find very, very, which I really, really love. And then we looked at Joanna Macy's three turnings. So holding actions, creating the life we want to live in, and working with our minds. And we can reflect on which of these we feel drawn to or might particularly want to be able to embody where we are in our lives at the moment. I've given you various examples in different shapes of like Buddhists doing stuff. There are many, many more. And yeah, then we looked at the 5 precepts, and I gave you just some short examples around what they might mean for engaged Buddhism. You might have your own examples, or you might have some questions about that. But anyway, that's my talk.